World Financial Group offers entrepreneurs from all backgrounds the opportunity to start their own business on a level playing field. Dr. Yana Woodhouse, receiving the WCM Wall Street Pioneer Award by the United Black Wall Street of America, Inc., is one of those entrepreneurs.
I see WFG and TFA as a place where African Americans with an entrepreneurial mindset can flourish. And the bonus, we help families and serve the communities across the country.
To learn more about us, go to worldfinancialgroup.com.
We are the sons and daughters of the soul. We are resilient and forever forward-thinking. We ask for nothing else than the opportunity to live and to create the lives that we were meant to live. We want nothing but an equal chance at options and possibilities. The same possibilities and options to live out our potential as our fellow man. We want to be heard, understood, and expressive in our reality. We are the future. We are the creative. We are here.
This is Kia Rogers, and you're listening to Urbanology with my dad, Tony Rogers, on WHCR 90.3 FM New York.
Good afternoon. Tony Rogers here, your host for Urbanology, the Art of War. And for many of you who may be new to this show, the Art of War is kind of a play on words. My name is William Anthony Rogers, as my mom always reminded me. Tony is not on my birth certificate. However, many of my colleagues and friends after my 20s, I suppose, started calling me Tony. Anyone who calls me Anthony knew me as a teenager or younger. But nevertheless, we're here today, and I have a good friend, and I'm so excited to have this brother on my show. We are, I think, 2 days away from the birthday of Malcolm X. And one of the things that has always been amazing to me is a lot of how misinformation have always been circulated around Malcolm and who he was or who he wasn't. A. Peter Bailey, I met him in an organization by the name of Blafrica, which turned into the Greater Harlem Chamber of Commerce, which developed Harlem Week. And Peter was one of the first journalists to write about Harlem Week in the papers. He was an associate editor for Ebony magazine when Ebony was the only thing in town as it relates to understanding what people of color, especially blacks, whether they were movie stars, athletes, or business persons, or what have you. And then Peter became the editor for the OAU newsletter, which was Malcolm's newsletter after he left the Nation of Islam. Peter has done a number of books. He still does a lot of writing, even for Harlem Week, actually. And he has a book coming out perhaps around June, I believe. He'll give us a little more information about that. about some other issues that were not really discussed or covered correctly as relates to Malcolm, and maybe even about Malcolm's assassination. So I have a tremendous honor of introducing you to a good friend, a brother that's been in the struggle for a long time, and one of the best writers I know, A. Peter Bailey.
Hello, Tony. How you doing? And thanks for inviting me. And I would just like to say, I was with Brother Malcolm before I got on the Ebony staff.
Okay.
I was first with Brother Malcolm from and then after his assassination, about 3 years after that, I was taken onto the staff of Ebony magazine. But my having been with him, I think, played a major role in my getting on Ebony's staff.
That makes sense.
Basically, he was the one who introduced me to journalism.
Right.
Until I met Brother Malcolm, I had never even remotely considered being a journalist.
Well, I know the story, but this gives the listeners a brief understanding of how you met Malcolm. I think it was a fascinating story.
Okay. Well, I moved to Harlem in the summer of 1962. June 1962, I moved to Harlem. And I moved in, I remember, on a Friday night. And on that Saturday morning, a friend who had helped me to move, we decided that rather than unpack, we were going to walk around Harlem. Because, we had really heard some horror stories about Harlem. I moved to Harlem rather reluctantly until I got this incredibly cheap rent on 142nd Street between Lenox and 7th. So when we got there, we decided to walk down what was then Lenox Avenue, now Malcolm X Boulevard. But we walked down Lenox Avenue. We were going to walk to 125th Street. We got there and decided to walk a little further and went down to 116th and saw a crowd gathering. And we asked people what was going on, and they say that Malcolm X was going to speak because 116th and then Lenox was where the Nation of Islam mosque was located. And they were setting up across the street, that wide sidewalk there. So we say, let's see what he's got to say. And he spoke for about 30 minutes. I don't know what I'm talking about 3 hours. But when he talked about one thing, especially that I had never heard anyone talk about in my life, and that was psychological warfare. I had never heard anybody talk about that. And so I became a supporter immediately. I became an instant Malcolmite. Despite the fact before I heard him speak, I'd heard all these little negative things about him, that people were spreading around. I didn't know him at all. So I began to follow him after that. And then in 1965, a friend named Lynn Shiflett, who was working then as an intern at Time Inc. And I was working at Time Inc. in the editorial reference department, which means that I took calls from the reporters for bio files. And it was under Rockefeller Center, so we would meet there in Rockefeller Center and sometimes talk about different things. And one day she said to me, "How would you like to be part of a new organization?" And I say, "Yeah, a new Black nationalist organization." And that kind of surprised me because in our conversations, I never thought of Lynn as a Black nationalist. She looked very, very, AKA type. But I realized, she was an intern at Time Inc., so she had to dress like that, be an intern, at, I'm sorry, not at Time Inc., at NBC, which is also a part of the Rockefeller Center complex. So I said, okay. She said, well, I'll call you on Saturday morning and tell you where to meet, and what time, and don't ask any questions. So I said, okay. I get the call. She tell me where to meet, and it kind of surprised me because of that school at that 153rd, and I think it was St. Nicholas, but it was a school. It was like not a school, but a hotel there. Had a terrible reputation of being one of the places you could check in for 2 hours. And I said, we're going to be meeting there. I said to myself, we're going to be meeting there? So I went up and I went in the conference room of this place was on the ground level. I got up the bus. I went in. There were about maybe 8 or 9 people there. Just a couple I recognized. John Henry Clark, although I didn't know him, I recognized him. John Oliver Killens. Lynn was there, of course, and her friend Muriel, who I had met, who was a good friend of hers. In fact, they were roommates. And then the other 4 or 5 people I did not know. So we sat down at a table and talked. I still don't know what's going on. And after I've been there maybe about 15 to 20 minutes, in walks Brother Malcolm. And it wasn't until he walked through that door that I found out that I was going to be a part of a new organization with Brother Malcolm. And he came in and sat down and introduced himself. We introduced ourselves. And that began the formation of the organization called the Organization of Afro-American Unity, the OAAU, which Brother Malcolm had set up specifically because he knew there were people out there who wanted to work with him, but who were not Muslim or who were not prepared to become Muslim. So he had already set up Muslim Mosque Incorporated for his fellow Muslims who were following him, as a Muslim. But he set up the OAAU for those of us who wanted to work with him and support him, but who were not going to become Muslims. And that's how we got started. And we met there, and the organization was officially announced on June 28, 1964. It was officially announced. And that's how I met Brother Malcolm. And when as we were meeting, after a couple of months of meeting, people started talking about the different committees they were going to be on: the youth committee, the education committee, the economics committee, the political committee, and nobody. And Brother Malcolm, has always had the belief that he told us, and he had told us just before this, that if you have an organization, you must have your own means of communications, because you can't depend on nobody else, even people who might like you. You cannot depend on them to report your stuff the way you want to. You have to have your own instrument for communications. And nobody volunteered to do the newsletter. So I volunteered to do the newsletter. And that's how I got into journalism.
Which is an interesting story. And when I talked to my good friend Matt McCoy that you met, who's the CEO of Soul City, and was doing very well for himself, and then he had an opportunity to get into this type of a market with a network, which and his position was, he says, yeah, I'm giving up all of this luxury stuff to do this, but we could change the narrative. We can do things that is the most important thing. I mean, now when you start to look at television is moving into streaming and on-demand stuff, and to be able to have an opportunity to have you on, or to have people on that can allow for us to understand the truth, which is what you were doing many years ago. Not to put age or years on you, brother, but this is something that was being talked about by Malcolm way before people started to really understand.
He understood very clearly that if you have an organization and you have something you're trying to do, you must have your own means of communication. He was the main person who set up Muhammad Speaks. He set that up. That's interesting. Yes. He was the main person to set that up. Because I met some people who were working with that publication kind of like when they first tried to get started, and they said that paper did not get off the ground until Brother Malcolm came in there, joined the nation, and got it structured and set up. And so he understood the importance of controlling your own communications instrument. And I think to this day, most of our people in this country in 2022, they just don't understand that. They don't understand the importance of having your own means of communications.
Which again, I know Matt is behind, smiling, but the whole idea is to control your narrative, which is kind of like the motto of Soul City: control your narrative. My cousin, who has the Harlem Community News, she had a battle because she would only print good news. And nobody, and for all of these years, people would not sponsor her. They would get pissed off because if something happened, she wouldn't print it. She says, "I'll print the outcome. I'll print what's good." But I'm not. You got enough people talking about what's bad or what we ain't doing or what we should be doing or who did this to who. So her whole thing is that I'm only going to print good news that people can use, and all of that stuff. Listening to you is a very interesting understanding now that we are coming towards a celebration of the life of Malcolm, is that he's the one, when nobody else was thinking about that, was making that happen. And you're an example, a living example of how there's nothing new under the sun.
He is the total reason that I'm a journalist. Because I tell you, up until that time, until I met Brother Malcolm, I was thinking maybe about being a teacher. You know, I must say that I loved history.
Well, you are a teacher in a different way.
Because I have taught at three colleges and universities, and I have lectured at about 40 or 50 colleges and universities around the country. But what I'm saying is that I had planned on like teaching, like, you know, being a teacher until I met Brother Malcolm, and I ended up being a journalist. But he was the one. More than anything else in my life, that's how I ended up being a journalist.
We're going to get back to Malcolm, because I know that there's so many stories that you experienced that people just don't know about, even as it relates to the newspaper. But within a short time, Ebony magazine at one point was the major, again, we're talking about communication and narratives, and to a certain degree, Mr. Johnson was able to structure a magazine that spoke to Black people.
Yeah, Mr. Johnson, again, Mr. Johnson also understood the importance of controlling your own communications. He understood that very clearly. Now, one thing about Mr. Johnson and that's how I ended up, you know, on Ebony magazine staff. Eventually, despite the fact that I had, other than working with Brother Malcolm, I had no journalistic experience at all. But Ebony took me on. Mr. Johnson took me on the Ebony staff in 1968. And because he also understood the importance of communications, and he knew that I understood the importance of communications from having worked with Brother Malcolm and other things that he knew about my background. I had worked at Time Inc. in the department that they had. Was called the bio. They had two files: the company files and the bio files. The bio files were anybody that Time Inc. wrote about or dealt with on an individual level, and the company files, you know, dealt with the people from the business world. But my job was to go through 7 New York City newspapers every day and read them and take out the names of people who appeared in these papers, and then put them into their files, you know, in the Time Inc. stuff. So I was doing that kind of stuff when I met Brother Malcolm. But again, that prepared me for journalism, and I think that was one reason why Mr. Johnson, you know, later hired me on the staff of Ebony, despite the fact that I had no kind of, you know, except by working with Brother Malcolm. I had no journalistic background.
Now, you went to Tuskegee, though, didn't you?
I grew up in Tuskegee. Yeah. I never went to college there. I went to elementary school there. And I went my first year and a half of high school there. The middle of my sophomore year in high school, my father, who was in the military, was stationed in Nuremberg, Germany. And so he took the whole family over there. And I went my last 2.5 years of high school in Nuremberg, Germany. And it was Nuremberg American High School. It was a high school for children of military personnel. And of course, I went from total segregation to a situation where I was the only Black person in my class. My sophomore year, when I got down in the middle of my sophomore year, my junior year and my senior year, I was the only Black person in my class. I went from a total Black thing to something like that.
It must have been interesting.
It was, believe me, it was.
During your time with Ebony, you had an opportunity to interview many, because everybody who's anybody was on Ebony. What was one or two of your most intriguing interviews as far as celebrities or sports or business persons or people for Ebony?
Okay, I think one of them to me, because although I was on the staff of Ebony, in the New York office where I worked, you had an Ebony editor, a Jet editor, 2 photographers, and then an administrative assistant.
And Peter, before you, for those young people, there was Ebony, and then there was Jet. And so some people, Jet might have been even more popular because I think it was less expensive for certain things. Whatever I did in my life, when I got into Jet, my mother finally realized that I was doing something that was powerful. But go ahead.
In fact, when I was working there, I took the job, Now this is after I've been with Brother Malcolm and all of that. I had 2 years of college at Howard University. I mean, I did have some, college background. I took that job. I took the job as a mailroom clerk, and I took it with the idea that if I get it there, get it that mailroom, man, I'm going to get myself up to the staff of either Jet or Ebony. And at that time, I wanted to be on Jet staff more than Ebony. So I became very friendly with the then Jet editor. And and sometimes he would have me go to things because, there were some things that he would have me go to because I knew all the people in Harlem and everything like that. Not everybody, but I knew the major. And so something would go, I would go to it, then I'd bring him back the information. So, and so when the time came that I, ended up being on the Ebony staff, but I still wrote for Jet. And so when I talk about you talk about my most fascinating articles, I do Ebony and Jet. I think one was when I had to interview Adam Clayton Powell for Jet magazine, right after he lost, that primary contest to Charlie Rangel. And I just never remember how Adam Clayton Powell. When I interviewed him that day up in Athens City, man, that joker was cussing every other word I've about. I had to really clean that article up to write it. I always remember that. And then
in the church.
In the church, in his office in the church, man. I mean, that joker was. I mean, I will never forget that, man. I was cracking up laughing as to how am I going to, clean this up so I can put it in the magazine. You know what I mean? But at the same time, still get his point, out about his feelings about what had happened with that,
now,
with that election.
He believes that the election was stolen.
Yeah, he said his thing was they had expanded that district so that it included Columbia University. And that's how he ended up getting beaten. Because before he was in Central Harlem, his district was in Central Harlem.
Right.
And before the next election, they expanded that district so that it went over to include Columbia. And of course, what does that mean?
And that's actually happening now again as relates to this whole gerrymandering and all of that stuff.
Yes.
What about celebrities? What celebrity do you remember?
I remember Walt Frazier.
Huh?
I remember.
What was that like? Who was Walt Frazier?
The great basketball player with the New York Knicks.
I know, but what was it like interviewing him? We know that side, but what about
I'd always been a basketball fan. Right. I'd always been a basketball fan. And that's when he was Clyde. And when I was interviewing him, I was riding around Manhattan with him. He had this big, I don't know cars, but whatever is the biggest car of that time. I think it was a Rolls Royce or whatever it was. But I was riding around all around, Manhattan everywhere with him in that car while I'm interviewing him. And so I just thought that was absolutely fascinating, man, to spend that much time with him and to listen to him talk. Plus, I realized that the brother was more, he had a business mind. He had a business mind, which is why he ended up being successful after he left basketball.
Right. And
you found very few basketball players in those days who had the kind of business mind that Walt Frazier had. And another article I did an article on Yolanda King and Attila Shabazz, Brother Malcolm's oldest daughter and Martin Luther King's oldest daughter. I introduced them to each other, and I wrote an article in Ebony on them. That was a memorable article. Another article I remember, this brother down in North Carolina. Was it North Carolina, South Carolina? It's in South Carolina. This brother Rex Harrison, he had opened up a cleaning business down there, and the big army base. There was a big army base nearby, and because of the times, this is in the late 1960s, the army had decided that they were going to give him some of the cleaning some of the soldiers' clothing because everybody was getting with white boys. So when they did that, then they firebombed his place and burned it to the ground. And he built it back up. And Ebony sent me down to do an article on him. And I went down and Monetta Sleet and we went down there, man, and rode around with him. And he talked about how that brother was riding around with a shotgun on the seat of his car. He told us to get in the back seat because he had a shotgun on the front seat where he was. That was, and this is now we talk about early 1970s.
Okay.
When that was a dangerous thing to do. That was another fascinating. I mean, that was just so many, man, of things like that. Of Alvin Ailey. You know, I got to know and meet Alvin Ailey and became convinced that he's one of the greatest cultural figures of the 20th century. You know, because he told me. A lot of people told me later, people who had known him for years, man, he told you a lot of stuff. And I've known him for 30 years. He never told me nothing like that. You know, and I guess because, you know, I could listen. I could listen, and I would listen to people and let them talk, and then I would ask questions based on, you know, on what I heard. I wasn't writing like I was trying to dig up something. You know what I mean?
Right.
And that kind of thing. And they felt that. So they would be more honest with me. A lot of times people told me that it seems as though people talk to you are more honest with you and tell you more about them than some of the other people that I've had. I had a couple of other ebony people tell me that. But Alvin Ailey, you know, was I did an article on the Black Theater in Harlem. In New York at that time, when the Black theater companies were doing all kind of incredible work, and I got Ebony. Ebony had never done an article on Black theater until I he covered, you know, Black theater. They did article made, you know, big name entertainers,
right?
But they didn't put them into a cultural complex. So I finally got them to do a major article on Black theater. Dreamgirls was the first time Ebony did an article on a Broadway show. Because Mr. Johnson's attitude was they don't advertise in Ebony, so I'm not gonna do articles on it. The Dreamgirls took out an ad, and so that's when they put them on the cover of Ebony magazine, Dreamgirls. And
Peter, question: when you were around at the beginning of Harlem Day, would you have guessed that it would be where it is today?
I'll be very frank, I would not have. But by the time I left Harlem, by the time I left Harlem, I knew that this was a serious setup. When I left Harlem in 1986,
right,
and I moved to Richmond, Virginia, to take a job at Virginia Union University. But by then, I'm not surprised that it is still around now, because by the time I left, I realized that they're feeling a vacuum that exists here, man. This is. Because at that time, when Harlem Week was started, even Black people were still talking about Harlem as though it was some kind of hood zone, you know, as though it was some, you know, ain't nothing up there but, you know, but drug dealers and drug users.
Because we didn't have our own narrative. Right.
And if you go there, man, you're going to get, you know, you're putting your life in danger just walking the streets. I mean, that was the attitude that people had about Harlem. And Harlem Week, by working started dealing with that type of attitude and changing it, made an incredible contribution to Harlem. And that's why I was very glad to get involved, because by that time, from being with Brother Malcolm and doing other things, I had already realized that Harlem, I never called Harlem the capital of Black America. Harlem to me was the cultural capital of Black America. It was not the economic capital. Or even the political. I considered it the culture, and culture is extremely important.
Yeah.
So you're not to me taking anything away from Harlem when you say that it was the culture, because culture is extremely important, because that's how a people see themselves.
Which is very important. Now,
it's very, very important.
You have a couple of publications that you were part of as it relates to Malcolm's various different types of his family and some of the other important periods of Malcolm's life. You have a new book coming up. Can you talk a little bit about
books
that you have had and the difference that the book that is coming out is going to be?
Well, I wrote a memoir called about Brother Malcolm, about that experience that I had working with him. I wrote a memoir about that. And this book that's coming out now, I'm writing it because I think one of the things that's missing so many times in writing about Brother Malcolm, including from people who basically, you know, a sympathy with him, is that what he was doing internationally, and why he was so important, and why the government considered him such a danger. Brother Malcolm, from the OAAU, the OAAU was named after the Organization of African Unity.
Okay.
That's how we got the name Organization of Afro-American Unity.
Mm-hmm.
The OAAU, and it was that was done deliberately because Brother Malcolm's position was, and he believed this to his very bones, that the fate of people of African descent around the world is dependent on a closely connective, unifying relationship between African people on the continent and people of African descent in North America. He believed that this is.
Believe that, brother. You know, but we'll talk about that later. But that's
He believed that is the absolute key,
and it still is.
Yes.
More than ever.
Yes, and which is why everybody makes such an effort to keep that relationship from developing.
Exactly.
Because they know what that will mean, and most people don't know they're doing the Brother Malcolm started working on this in January. We said the OAAU. We began to meet in January 2014. We didn't really it wasn't announced public to June. But in the meantime, we were having meetings and setting up committees and that kind of thing. But in the meantime, Brother Malcolm was traveling in Africa. And in May 1964, Brother Malcolm, Tony, went to Africa. And while he was there, he had audiences. And this is extremely important. He didn't have I meet you at a reception, we say hello, we talk for a couple minutes, and that's it. He had audiences ranging from 1.5 hours to 3 hours with the following: President Ezekwe of Nigeria, President Nasser of Egypt, President Nkrumah of Ghana, President Nyerere of Tanzania, President Kenyatta of Kenya, President Toure of Guinea, and Prime Minister Obote of Uganda. He had audiences with these brothers ranging from 1.5 hours to 3 hours. As a result of that, when the OAU held its meeting in July 1964 in Cairo, Brother Malcolm was invited as an observer, not as a participant, but as an observer. And it was the first time a person of African descent in the United States had been see that kind of invitation to that event. And he went to that event, and at that event, he presented an 8-page document that's going to be in my book, in which he outlined why it was so critical for the people on the continent and people in North America to get together and work with each other. And because of what he did, the groundwork he laid, the OAU, and this is the first and only time it has happened, the OAU in August of 1964 issued a resolution condemning discrimination in the United States. That was unheard of. Hasn't happened before or since. And what Brother Malcolm, his goal was to have the United States taken before the United Nations Commission on Human Rights for being either unable or unwilling to protect the lives and property of Black people. Now, at that time, the United States had not signed the UN Charter, and they had not signed it for a very specific reason. If they had signed it, then an individual or a local organization based in the United States could have taken the case to the UN. Because they had not signed it, then you had to get a UN member to take your case to the UN Commission on Human Rights. And Brother Malcolm was trying to get African members of the UN to take the case to the UN Commission on Human Rights. And that's what he was working on throughout the entire last 15 months of his life. And I'm in the book that I'm working on, I'm documenting this. The whole book is going to be, I'm using primary source. The first section of the book is going to be Brother Malcolm in his own words talking about his Pan-Africanism and why it was so important. In his own words, I don't copy. Everything is him speaking. Either he's speaking to students, he's talking to the presidents, to the presidents. He's press releases about his beliefs about Pan-Africanism. All of the second section are the FBI files. The FBI files that covered what he was doing while he was moving around, working on his campaign. The third section are the OAAU newsletters, because our newsletter was covering what he was doing in Africa, and it ended up doing 9 total issues, and I'm running all 9 issues in the book. And that's going to be the third. And then the last section are going to be the coverage of what he was doing in Africa that ran in American newspapers and in books. And in all of this, I'm using the original sources. I am not having it rewritten. I'm making copies of it and then putting it in the book just like that. And of course, I have to make sure that because if you go use too much of something like that, you have to get rights. So I'm making sure that I use a paragraph, but those paragraphs that I pick out, explain what Brother Malcolm was doing internationally, and so that's the whole. And as I tell people, I'm not trying to write the definitive book on that subject, but what I do want to write is a book that will introduce people to what he was doing internationally, and the book is going to be called Brother Malcolm X's Strategic. Brother Malcolm X. Strategic Pan-Africanism. And then the subtitle is An Important Guide for People of African Descent.
That's very interesting and timely. As you know, I don't think I had a chance to talk to you. Recently, I developed, it's in development, a project called Awakening of the Sleeping Giant, which is talking about creating a way to get African Americans and Caribbean Americans in particular to return to Africa and start doing business and just travel, just to begin to understand that there is a place that you can connect to. And as we were saying at the beginning of the show, by not being able to control the narrative, the information that Africans have had about African and Caribbean Americans has been almost as polluted as the information that Americans have with Africans, and for really strategic reason from the colonizer is because once that awakening comes to be, the power of the African diaspora will automatically influence the politics that are taking place in East Africa, North Africa even at this point. So again, what we're saying, what the vision that Malcolm had, it is something that is still relevant today, even more so, because now, based on the lack of resources and many other and the lack of any type of way to balance the notes, they call it fiat money, when you're printing money and you don't have any resources, goals, or any other way to back that money up. Africa is becoming rediscovered, whether it's China or many other locations, because of the resources. Again, going full circle. The only way that is going to be addressed is for the awakening of the African diaspora. That's the next step. And there are a lot of, I'm sure, people, as in the past, who would not like to see that happen, but based on how we are now with our communication systems, going back to speaking our narratives, we all can speak our narratives because of the internet and ways to do that. When does your book plan? What's your schedule now, Peter, for the book? And I know you're coming here for some ceremonial stuff as it relates to Malcolm. Can you talk a little bit about both of those things? I guess the first thing is what you'll be doing when you're here as relates to honoring Malcolm X. And second, when do you think that people will be able to acquire your book? Peter? I hope I didn't lose you. But at any rate, hopefully he will be coming back in. And if for some reason I did lose him, I will make sure that we have the information available for those who may be interested in understanding exactly what's going on. And a lot of it will be if you go turn on WHCR or Harlem Community News or even Soul City. I'm sure that you'll be able to obtain information as relates to some of the activities that will start to take place celebrating the life of Malcolm X. There's so many other things that I wanted to ask Peter as relates to some of the experiences in which he had.
So what happened?
Malcolm, I think. Peter, you're back.
Yeah, I don't know what happened.
Well,
I didn't touch nothing. I did not touch nothing.
Well, maybe I don't know. So I was just saying to you, I wanted to find out one. You're coming here. What are some of the events you'll take part in as relates to the life of Malcolm? And second, when can people acquire your book? When will it be ready?
Okay. Well, I'm planning on coming up, Thursday, May 19th,
right,
to go to an event that's being held that evening, May 19th in the evening at 7 to 10 p.m. at the Malcolm X Betty Shabazz Educational and Cultural Center.
Uh-huh.
They're having an event there from 7 to 10 p.m. I'm coming up to attend that. The rest of the time I'm up there. I'm not.
What day is that again? What day is that event?
It's going to be on May 19th, his birthday.
Uh-huh.
In the evening from 7 to 10 p.m. at the Malcolm X Dr. Betty Shabazz Education and Cultural Center, which of course is part of the old Audubon Ballroom on 168th Street.
And that's open to the public.
But you have to have tickets. I don't know.
Eventbrite. I'm pretty sure you can go to Eventbrite or Google or contact them.
Find out about how you get in there. Yeah. Right. But I'm coming up for that. That's the reason I'm coming up. Friday, and then I'm going to, like I said before, I'm going to be meeting with the young brother who's helping me, make some of the changes I want to make in the book. I'm work with him while I'm up there. But other than that, I'm just going to kind of, walk around a little bit, see friends I haven't seen in a while, since this whole COVID-19 stuff started. And I'll be doing that on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And I'm going to really, I look forward to that.
Right.
And I look forward to being, doing something that represents, that's honoring what will be his 97th birthday.
Wow. Now, when do you think your book will be available to the public?
When I come back next Monday, by the end of that week, I hope to have the book with the printer. I'm not getting it published, because if you get a book published, then the publisher has control of your book for at least 10 years or so. I'm just getting a printer who's going to print the book for me, in any number that I want, because I want to keep complete control of the book.
Mm-hmm.
And so right now my plan is maybe sometime by mid-July, if I can get it to them, say by June 1st, I may be able to actually have copies before the end. Let's say from the mid to the end of July.
Okay. So maybe during Harlem Week we can do some marketing stuff for it.
Yeah.
Let you come full circle. And there are other things to the tourism board and some other things that we'll do. Maybe
I'm planning on having book signings, get-togethers in Washington D.C. and in Harlem.
In August.
In August, yeah.
Okay. All right, so we should talk about that. If I can be helpful,
Okay.
I'll be glad to do that. And we'll, when you do that, we'll have you come back and do some things with Soul City or WCR, the radio component of it. And you've been on WCR again, also the radio. Because it's important that people understand that history. And before I let you go, we have a couple of more minutes. We were talking about your collection. Can you talk a little bit about the collection that you have and what you're looking to do with that collection?
Okay, well, of course, I have a Malcolm X collection. Right. And I haven't decided yet what I'm going to do with that.
Now, what does that entail?
Man, I have photographs. I have documents. I have letters. I have books. I have, albums. The albums of him, of him speaking. I have just all kinds of stuff. Mm-hmm. In my Malcolm X collection. And of course that is, and I got to get it organized. In fact, this young brother Jason I'm telling you about, who Iran, the young brother who's working with me now, he's one of the people. I'm gonna get about 3 or 4 young brothers and sisters who go when by the time school starts again in September. They're students at Howard University. I'm going to get them to help me get my Malcolm X collection organized.
Okay.
So I can have it, because it's really not organized. I got them in these big crates sitting in my apartment, in my living room. I got these big crates with all this stuff in it. A second thing I have is I collect, like I said before, volume 1, number 1 of Black magazines. I have about 100 of those. I have the first issue of Essence, the first issue of Ebony, the first issue of Black Enterprise, the first issue of Freedom Waves, and on and on. I have first issues of Black magazines that only came out 1 issue. They never made a second issue. I have volume 1, number 1s. I have about 100 of those. And the only one I don't have, although I have a copy of the cover, I have never been able to get a volume 1, number 1 of Jet magazine. but I do have a copy of that cover. I don't have that magazine, but I do have a copy of that cover.
What was in the copy of the first Jet magazine?
It's a picture of Sugar. Remember the boxer Sugar Ray Robinson?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
A picture of his wife, and the lead article is "How I Got a $10,000 mink coat." November the 1st, 1951. Wow. That was the first Jet magazine. Now I have a copy, and a brother that I know, he collects Jet. This brother has every single Jet magazine that has ever been published. I've never seen anything like it in my life. Jet came out 52 weeks a year, so you know how many. His whole basement is nothing but cases, but bookshelves with Jet magazines on it.
Well, that was a Bible. I mean, the Jet.
He has every single Jet magazine that has ever been published.
Wow.
I went over his house, man. I could not believe it. And he also had volume 1, number 1. So he made me a copy of the cover. Oh, and that's how I ended up getting a copy, although I've never had the magazine itself.
I'm sure, going through that, though, the history of the people that we read about, that we hear about, things.
Go ahead.
I mean, it's amazing how an organization is able to capture the Black experience for so many years.
Tony, growing up in Tuskegee, Alabama, when I was a kid, my connection with the national Black community was Jet magazine and the Pittsburgh Courier newspaper. My parents and grandparents subscribed to both of those publications, and I used to read them every week. I went through every word in Jet magazine and every word in the Pittsburgh Courier. That's why I was always but which shows that even when I was very young, I was always interested in history for some reason, and in reading. I mean, I wasn't like no bookworm. I played, I ran around with my friends, we played and all that. But when it was quiet time, when it was raining, or you had to be, or I was being punished. At quiet time, I read. I've always, ever since I was very young, I enjoyed reading. But I don't know about thinking now that I was one of these people, oh, well, he read all the time. No. I played football, the football, but we played softball with tennis balls and broomsticks. So, I mean, I was an active kid. But whenever that was quiet time, when it was raining, you couldn't go outside, that kind of thing, I would read.
Did you ever interview Percy Sutton?
Yes, I interviewed Percy immediately after the election of Charlie Rangel.
There's a lot of stories about that election.
and I also I had met Percy earlier because Percy handled legal things for Sister Betty after the assassination.
Right, because
that's when I was lawyer. Yeah, that's when I first met him. When he was Brother Malcolm's lawyer. That's when I first met him. And I began to realize that this brother was a whole different brother, because I knew him only from what you read in the papers, But that's when I got a chance to really meet him, and I became a big admirer of Percy, man, because Percy did some serious legal work for Sister Betty, especially after the assassination, when so many people tried so many things in terms of, of taking materials and all that kind of stuff. He was very, very helpful to her during that period.
Yeah, and he was, and actually he was a Tuskegee Airman too.
Yeah. And I used to ask him about that because I grew up in Tuskegee. Actually, Percy, whatever happened, because I remember when I was a kid in Tuskegee, I had a friend, her birthday was July 4th. And from the time we were like about third grade until we got to be about ninth grade, every day, every year on her birthday, we would go out to that airfield where those planes were. And we were playing those planes, but nobody told us the historical. We didn't know the history. We just thought they were fun. They had them tied down. They had them tied down with these anchored and tied down with these big, these big brick cement stuff, and then these big chains had them tied down. And I remember one day I was sitting in the cockpit with one of them, and I was playing like I was pushing all these buttons and everything. And a friend of mine, without me knowing it, he had gone down on the wing. And it started bouncing up and down. So the plane started bouncing. And I thought I had pushed up to get ready to start that plane off, boy. Scared me half to death. I would to fight that joker, man, when I found out what really went on. But he was bouncing up and down on that plane, man, and scared me so bad. Because I was sitting in the cockpit just pushing buttons. But nobody ever told us the historical significance of that.
Right.
I was never taught that. I didn't find that out until I became an adult after leaving Tuskegee.
Now, Juneteenth is now a national holiday.
Mm-hmm.
Did you ever do anything in relationship to Juneteenth?
I really didn't. I didn't really find out until Juneteenth, until 25 years ago or so. I never paid that much attention. I never knew very much about Juneteenth. Right. And I think what they did this year, these people every now and then. See, my thing is, we should not need to get something declared a federal holiday for us to celebrate it. We should celebrate what we consider holidays our own, no matter what happens.
This is true.
And so I think, every now and then these people do what I call them. They do these feel good type things for us. And I think the Juneteenth thing was one of those feel good type things. But if we think Juneteenth is important, then we celebrate it, no matter what, they do. We don't need that thing to celebrate things that we consider holidays.
Well, personally, I always celebrated the 19th of June because that was my birthday. So.
Oh, okay.
So now that it's a national holiday, that's icing on the cake. But
yeah,
19th of June was always a celebration for me. I didn't know the significance of it either. Other than that was when I came on the planet. But
I was an adult. I was an adult, and it was after I met Brother Malcolm where I began to really seriously study Black history.
Right.
Seriously study it. I'd heard about. I mean, the person who introduced me to Black history was a professor at Howard University named Dr. Harold Lewis. I went there when I got out of the military at the age of 20. I went to Howard University, and I'm in the middle of the school year, so my freshman year. Then the second year was my first part of the semester was into my freshman year. The second part was my sophomore year. Well, in the first part of my freshman year, I took a class in history with Dr. Harold Lewis. That was my introduction to Black history. And I remember the first day of class, he said to us, all your lives, you study the history of people of European descent. In this class, you're going to study the history of the rest of the people in the world. And that's where I was introduced. He said, going to be introduced to. And that's where I was introduced to African American history, Native American history, some Chinese history, some Japanese history, and some Native American history. But that's where I was introduced to our history. And I will always believe that Dr. Lewis was one of the people who made me kind of at least a little bit open when I finally had the opportunity to meet Brother Malcolm.
Now, we have a couple of minutes. This may be an interesting question for you to answer, but in your time dealing with what are your fondest memories of that relationship?
Brother Malcolm?
Yeah.
I think the thing that I remember most clearly was I wrote an article in the very first issue of the newsletter about the 1964 uprising in Harlem after this policeman killed that 15-year-old boy. Mm-hmm. Now, at the time, Brother Malcolm was in Africa. But he would call back early to kind of get an update of what was going on. And then we had to, those of us who had different, responsibilities, like I was editor of the newsletter. And he would speak to us. So when it was my turn to speak with him, I read him what I had written. Because I had gone over to and talked to some of the students who were eyewitnesses to that shooting. And it was my first journalistic article in the very first issue of at that time we called the OAAU newsletter. It later became the Blacklash, with the first 3 issues. So in the very first issue, I wrote this article. My first journalistic article was in this issue. And Brother Malcolm, when it was my turn to speak with him, when he called the office, I read him what I had written. And so I said, eyewitnesses to the murder. And Brother Malcolm stopped me. He said, no, Brother Peter, you can't say murder. Murder and murderer are legal terms that you can only use once the person has been convicted. If you call him and we know that he's not going to be convicted of this, and he can then sue you for defamation once it's all over. He said, call him a killer and refer to it as a killing because he's a killer and a killing no matter what the circumstances. So we had run off 500 copies of this, Brother Leonard Sneed and I. So we just scratched out the word murder and wrote killing at the top. Instead of rerunning, we had that back then. We had that old-fashioned thing. We had to turn those things, the old-fashioned make copies, the old-fashioned copy machine, And we didn't want to run off another 500, 600 of those things. So we sat down and went through all those things and scratched out the word murder and wrote killing at the top. And sure enough, when Gilligan, the policeman, was acquitted, he sued, I think, Martin Luther King's organization and a couple other things for calling him a murderer. And now that was one of my first friends, Brother Malcolm, on that level, And then what really is what I call a precious memories about that is that when he came back and we had a rally at the Audubon Ballroom, he asked me to come backstage, and I went backstage. And he said to me, Brother Peter, I hope you understood why I asked you to not use the word murder. I said, no, yes, I understood. And so he said, okay. And brother, that was it. But I remember that because here he was, doing all these things, and he was concerned about my feelings. And whenever I talk to students about him, I always tell that story. Not only did I learn something that I kept to me throughout my entire career about using words. And how I tell my students all the time, that thing they say sticks and stones can break my word, but sticks and stones may break, but words will never hurt me. I said that's one of the biggest lies ever been told. Words can not only hurt you, it can destroy you. You got to be very careful how you words. And but I always remember that, because despite this brother being under all that pressure and all those things happening and everything, he was concerned about my feelings.
Well, Peter,
and I have never forgotten that.
And that's probably why he was able to move so many minds into a certain type of direction based on not only his wisdom but his humane, his
yes,
and love for his people.
You know what? Whenever I speak to him now, let's say in the last 15 years, I developed this concept. I always say, Brother Malcolm was a great human being, a great Black man, a great Pan-Africanist, and a master teacher.
Well, Peter, that's a good way of ending. We will have you back. One of our media network when the book comes out. Give the listening audience one more time the title.
The title of the book I'm working on?
Yeah.
It's Brother Malcolm X's Strategic Pan-Africanism. And then the subtitle is An Important Guide for People of African Descent.
And that is,
it says compiled and edited by A. Peter Bailey.
Well, thank you, A. Peter Bailey. What you're saying is timely. We're doing things now with Senegal and some other countries to actually begin to awaken the sleeping giant. We'll be back. I'd like to thank Soul City, of course, Matt McCoy and the team. And thank you, Peter, for taking some time out of your busy schedule. I want to catch up with you when you're here. So
okay, Tony. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
For the 19th.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
It was a pleasure. It was a pleasure talking to you. We haven't talked in a while. This is Tony Rogers, your host for Urbanology, The Art of War. Wishing you a good day. And please stay in tune. Market in the Heights, Thursdays and Saturdays at the campus of City College. And soon, obviously, Harlem Week and many other events. The Father's Day bike race of Marcus Garvey Park on June the 19th. So you might want to, we'll be talking about that too, coming up shows. Thank you so much. Tony Rogers, I'm gone. See you.
This is Kia Rogers, and you're listening to Urbanology with my dad, Tony Rogers, on WHCR 90.3 FM New York.
Urbanology.